What I want to show you now is how absolute positioning works inside of relatively positioned elements. So I created this first page over here, and it's very, very simple. I created box 1 and box 2. Um, my HTML is equally simple. I just have box 1. There's no style to it except background color blue. And if you look at box 1, all the content in there, it's just a paragraph content with a good amount of stuff. And then box 2, I defined a width and a different background color. I defined the width for this because I want to show you how it could move around so it's not completely over the blue box. So let's start with the concept of absolute positioning. Now, absolute positioning basically takes an element out of the regular flow of the document, and then you could position it wherever you want within that element. So let's say that or within, more specifically, a relatively positioned element. So by default, this whole browser window you're looking at here has a relative positioning attribute set to it. You don't see it, but it's there. These are just some of the default CSS styles that exist. So what we could do at this point is add absolute positioning to one of these elements. I want to add absolute positioning to my box 2 element. So I'm going to go position absolute. And then when I refresh it, well, it added some default styles. We won't worry about them. But essentially, really, it didn't do much of anything as far as positioning things differently goes. Well, that's because we haven't added an attribute to it yet, which the attributes we could add are top, left, bottom, and right. And then we could add values to those attributes. So let me add top 0 to box 2 and show you what it does. All of a sudden, this guy over here is 0 pixels from the top of the relatively positioned element, which is the browser. Now, let's do bottom and show you exactly what happened now. It's at the bottom of that of the relatively positioned attribute. And if we do right, well, you guessed it, it's to the right. But it's actually not to the right top as you would think, because it still has this other div container that it's following. But that's okay, because guess what? You could combine those as well. So you could do right and top 0, and guess what? It's at the right top. Same thing, you could do top but left, and there you go. Now, obviously, you can't do left and right because if you really think about it, it doesn't make too much sense. So well, first, let's say that these two attributes over here, or the whole lot of 4 of them, they only work when you have absolute positioning set for that element. And then these will position themselves relative to a relatively positioned element. And by default, the relatively positioned element is the browser Chrome. But let's kind of go a little bit deeper so it makes more sense. I'm going to take this stuff off and just go back to how we were by default. But now I'm going to add a container to wrap all of these guys in. So I'm going to go here, create div id equals, and I'll name it container. And now if I go down to the bottom, I will close that container out. And I'm going to need to do some styling to it because as it stands, it's not going to do anything. So container, and I'll do margin, what is it, 0 and auto. That'll position it right in the middle. And actually above that, I'll give it a width of, say, 75%. So now, here we go. It's kind of the same thing, except it's positioned, within that container. And let's give it a little 50 pixels from the top. Oh, wait, what did I do? I changed the wrong thing. Auto, and we'll do 50 pixels from the top and bottom. There you go. So now you get that there's a container class in the middle of this thing, kind of. Wait, what am I looking for? Kind of, and keeping everything wrapped up. Now, if I go back to box 2 and I put that position left and top, and I'm going to save it, where would you guess this thing's going to be positioned? Well, let's give it a refresh, and there it is. Now, despite the fact that it's inside of that container, it's going to position itself, top and left 0 to the next parent element that has a relative positioning attribute set on it. And by default, that's the browser Chrome. But what if we didn't want that to go there? What if we wanted it to be relative to the container? Well, you guessed it. It's just as easy as going position relative. And check this out. Once I refresh this, where do you think it's going to go? That's right. All of a sudden, this thing is at the top left of the the closest relatively positioned container, which was the container. So now if we do this other thing of going right, it's going to go to the right over there. If we go here to the bottom, there you go. So that is how absolute positioning works within a relatively positioned element.